So I'll say a few things here while we're packing up here. Obviously, the title of the afternoon's panel will be Ending the Threat of Nuclear World War, the Pacific Century. And I think actually Bach is an interesting reflection point here. Bach was born approximately a generation after the end of the 30 Years Religious War. And this was in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years War, which was, in one sense, what we now see onrushing. Religious warfare with no purpose other than these wars being the playground of the empires of that time and now the empire of today. And I think that question of, what Bach's life was really born after that generation, or came to, being within that context. That the Treaty of Westphalia, what it did is it said, we don't care why we're fighting. It's time to give up the petty religious differences, whether Mary was a virgin or whether, this particular religious factor, which was the basis that people were being manipulated into warfare. And what the Treaty of Westphalia said is that we're going to come together based on a principle of the advantage of the other, which really was a Christian principle as expressed in those days, the idea that, but really a universal principle. We find this in all religions, and really is a universal conception of what it is to be human, that the concept of mutual benefit, that my interest lies in your interest as well, and my nation's interest lies in your nation's interests, and so on and so forth. And that concept of the Treaty of Westphalia was the foundation of the era of the modern nation state. And I bring this up because in 1999, Tony Blair, who, as many of you know, was the man who saved the monarchy, and in the era after the Queen Elizabeth was in trouble for the death of Princess Diana, and Blair had stepped in to make sure that the monarchy wasn't just brushed aside as it should be for all sane, civilized society. But instead, Blair came in to save the monarchy, and in 1999, he did a speech in Chicago where he said the age of Westphalia should now be over, that this concept of the modern nation state should be abolished, and we should move towards the globalized society that we now see, which is perpetual warfare. Look at what we've seen since 1999, when Blair was a key controller of both the Bush administration and now the Obama administration. And we've seen the breakout of what has the potential to be endless religious warfare. And so the question of the new paradigm, and the question that we'll be discussing here this afternoon, is how to reestablish a new era of Westphalia, a new era of getting rid of globalization and recognizing that peace amongst nations has to be accomplished through economic development, and that the development of another nation is in our interests, and that nation's interest is our development is in their interest. And I think this is what we will be discussing. This is going to be the new paradigm. This is what the perspective, especially for the West Coast, of the orientation increasingly towards Asia, towards the development of Asia. And so now I just want to make one quick point. We are on the edge of war, as Lynn discussed. And the last time that we had, or I should say in October of 2011, this was at a conference in Chinatown here in San Francisco. This is where LaRouche issued the warning of the danger of World War III. He had said that after the death of Gaddafi that they would move immediately into Syria and Iran, not with anything to do with Syria and Iran, but to set the staging ground for a war ultimately to target Russia and China. So this is where we're at in the world. The empire is coming unglued. They are pushing their endgame scenario in the middle of the financial collapse and moving for World War III. And the discussion this afternoon is going to be on what the alternative is, what we're going to bring in once we bankrupt the empire, and what kind of development perspective is brought in and the conceptions that are needed to do that. So we've already heard from the Helga LaRouche, who is known as the Silk Road Lady amongst certain circles in China because of this idea of all the development that we could have, the development through linking up through the Bering Straits Tunnel, integrated rail system, really development corridors, nuclear power, the whole perspective. And so we'll get into that. And I think in addition to Helga, obviously Leni Rubenstein, who knows her work, what she's done to organize networks in China, in Asia, and so forth. But Mike Billington has also played an absolutely crucial role. He's actually the head of the Asia desk for the Executive Intelligence Review magazine. And so we'll hear from Mike to start out the afternoon panel here. And I'd just like to say, for those of you who know Mike Billington's life, this is a man who has endured struggle. He was, as LaRouche was thrown into prison and many of his associates thrown into prison, Mike Billington was sentenced to 77 years in prison, served 10 of those years. And so I think, you'll hear from him a sense of that commitment to this mission now that's before us. And has, I know, a number of statements that come in from Asia. And so, anyway, Mike, are you here? Oh, there we are. Okay, so.
Thank you. I do have three statements from Asia, which I'd like to begin. One from the Philippines, from our organization in the Philippines, one from a very close friend in Japan, and one from a close friend in Russia. So I'd like to begin with a taped video from Butch Valdez, who heads the Philippine LaRouche Society and several other organizations that he's been the spearhead of building in the Philippines to save that crucial nation from its current demise in the midst of the war crisis and in the midst of the global economic breakdown.
Hi everyone. We bid you greetings from the Philippine LaRouche Society from the other side of the world. Due to difficulties encountered in making the trip possible to San Francisco, we have prepared this video. So please bear with me for the next few minutes. We here in the Philippines take inspiration from the words of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, as he had on several occasions told us via our radio program that our country, the Philippines, has a very special role in trying to save civilization. Just as we have been over the past so many centuries been the gateway of Western thought moving towards the eastern part of the world. We today have that special role to share with the rest of the world's population in this part of the world the ideas that are needed to be assimilated, the ideas that are needed to be implemented in order for us to save civilization from this present ongoing collapse of the financial system and threatening a situation that we all are very scared of, which is World War III. Our history with the United States goes a long way, all the way to probably the 1900s or even before that. But specifically in the 1900s, 1901, when the U.S. had bought us from Spain after Spain colonized us for pretty close to 400 years. And a new era for the Philippines started. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave us new hope in implementing many of the things that he had, as you all know what he had done for the United States. He had particular attention for the Philippines because we were at that time the only colony that needed to be given independence, true to the promise that he had made to the rest of the world. After granting us independence, the sorry thing that had happened was Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. But not without starting certain infrastructural development programs initiated by the very same people who may have started the Tennessee Valley Authority, putting the Philippines in a kind of foundation which would have allowed us the opportunity to develop as well. The role of the United States as a leader nation since 300 years ago has not stopped. It has in fact become even more significant and necessary at present times. We call on the members of the International LaRouche movement. We call on the citizens of the United States of America. And we call on the leaders of the United States of America to do everything that it takes to implement, reinstitute the Glass-Steagall Act as a primary and necessary step towards saving not just America, not just the Philippines, but the rest of the world. This has been your legacy since 1776, and this should be your legacy from this time on.
Butch has been the head of our work in the Philippines since the mid-'80s, when he read an article in our magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, written by my late wife, which said that the Philippines was about to become the next Iran soon after the Shah was overthrown and the country was turned over to Khomeini. And he at the time was supporting the attempt to overthrow President Marcos, one of the nationalist leaders of Asia. And he read our article and realized how absolutely wrong he'd been, and immediately contacted us and has been leading our work in that country ever since, quite effectively. The second greeting I have is from Mr. Daisuke Kotegawa. Mr. Kotegawa has given greetings to our previous conferences, including an extremely powerful presentation in Frankfurt earlier this year, which I encourage you to read if you have not. It's had a tremendous effect around Washington and around the world. You'll get a sense why. I'm not going to read the statement from today because it's somewhat duplicative, but I'm going to summarize what he said and then read the last couple of paragraphs, which are based on recent developments. Mr. Kotegawa was a leading minister of finance official in Japan during the 1990s when the Japanese went through their bursting of the bubble, similar to what happened here in 2007 and 8. And he, in fact, was the person responsible for unwinding the banking disaster that had hit that country. He makes the point that the current collapse was in the 2007-2008 collapse, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and so on, is entirely due to the takedown of Glass-Steagall in the United States. And, of course, it was also taken down simultaneously in places like Japan and Italy and so forth. which unleashed the gambling casinos, unleashed the investment bankers who were able to move in, take over the commercial banks, take over the deposits of average depositors, and use that for their massive gambling, and not only to gamble with it, but to have government guarantees to back them up when their bets went bad. He pointed out that in Japan, when he was in charge of restructuring the banking system in 97 and 98, they first of all unwound all of the gambling debts, the derivative debts. They made sure that before a bank was closed, that their international gambling debts were unwound so that the collapse of a bank would not have international repercussions. He said many of the bank's leaders who were responsible for creating the bubble were put on trial. Many of them went to jail. Many of them committed suicide, some of them his friends. But that this was necessary for the crimes that had brought the nation to a disaster. He said that all of the debt held by the banks had to be accounted in real terms, in what's called mark-to-market terms, not their nominal value, but the value they were actually worth on the market, which in many cases was zero. He said nothing like that happened in the United States. Nobody went to jail. No bank was put through an honest accounting of their bad debt. Instead, they were put through what he calls fake stress tests and given the go-ahead to continue the gambling operations, building up what is now a bigger financial bubble than the world had before the 2007 and 2008 collapse. The banks that should have been closed at that time, he said, were the very banks that went on to speculate against the European bond markets, bringing Europe to its current state of absolute disaster and responsible for the current mess that we're in here. His last two paragraphs read as follows. Recently, I was really shocked to learn that the Cyprus case of bailing in would not only be a template for future crisis management in Europe, but that such a system is already stipulated in the Dodd-Frank Act. This would mean that authorities in Europe and the United States put more priority on bailing out banks than defending the interest of depositors, and hence the confidence of depositors in their financial system. It violates the basic notion of how a bank can exist and operate, i.e., the confidence of depositors in their financial system. I hope that this kind of silly policy will be reversed as soon as possible, because this will have tremendous contagion effects to every other country in question. It would also go against the basic notion of democracy, whereby interests of the general public should prevail over those of specific interest groups. It is a vital need now that the Glass-Steagall Act should be reinstated and investment banks be liquidated as soon as possible to save Europe. This is a war against filthy bankers who gain a lot of money from gambling and letting taxpayers pay their losses, while they avoid even paying tax using tax havens and financial authorities who are their allies. This is a war for diligent workers who work hard, who save small amounts of money in deposits in commercial banks and honestly pay their debts. Mr. Kotegawa is now the senior director at the Cannon Institute in Tokyo and is retired from the ministry, but is still very, very active and doing extremely important work. The last message is from Russia. It's from Mr. Yuri Koltunoff, who is the leader of the International Development Movement and chairman of the Supervisory Council of the Institute for Demography, Migration, and Regional Development, and a close friend of the organization. He says, to the participants in the Schiller Institute Conference, A New Paradigm for the Survival of Mankind, the Second American Revolution. Dear conference participants, I greet the participants in this inspiring conference and hope that your work will be fruitful. The American Revolution is an event of universal significance, which made it possible for the people of the United States to build a powerful and independent nation and to set an example of making constructive transformations in the interests of all mankind. Today, the planet Earth, again, needs a new, creative, and constructive revolution, a revolution of development, as an explosive upsurge for the prosperity of all peoples of the world without exception. This revolution of development is directly opposed to the chaos which is cultivated in the interests of a thin layer of global elites who are indifferent to the historical and cultural interests of mankind. In this critical situation. The peoples of the United States and Russia have a special calling because we both have the experience of carrying out constructive revolutions and super-intensive industrializations. Our task today is to move through a new industrialization and new urbanization to overcome destructive entropy and act to bring a new paradigm to life, the paradigm of development. This means to organize development on a planetary scale, relying on fundamental science, education, culture, and advanced industry. The Pacific Ocean is of exceptional importance in this context. The imperative for Russia's own development today is to shift the center of our country toward the east, toward the Pacific Ocean, which in Russia was also called the Great Ocean. For Russia, the Great Pacific Ocean is not some alien place, nor are Alaska and California alien to us, for as you know from Fort Ross, which is nearby. The time has come to transform the Great Pacific Ocean into a great development zone for mankind. And our task is to demonstrate to the entire world through joint development projects a model of a different socioeconomic way of life, centered upon the divine genius of every person and upon respect for human history and culture. The youth of our nations must plan a decisive role in this. Your energy, determination, imagination, and faith in the creative, constructive abilities of man, who has the capacity to transform the earth into a blossoming garden, that is where the future lies and where there is hope. Be bold. I believe in you and your projects. With respects and best wishes for success, Yuri Koltunoff. So you can put the first slide up. I'm going to be addressing, in the next 20 minutes, the question of the relationship between Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Lyndon LaRouche, and the connection that implies between the United States, Russia, and China. It has been discussed here by several participants that the Obama administration and the British backers that support him, run him, are pushing us very, very close to war with Russia and China. In the case of Russia, it's over Syria, perhaps Iran, in a situation where the Russians are not going to allow Syria to be turned into a terrorist-run hellhole as was done in Libya. And in the case of China, Obama has adopted something called the air-sea battle doctrine, which is a pure-out plan for war on China. It's the official U.S. government Pentagon policy now. There's an article in the current issue of EIR, which I wrote on the air-sea battle and the institutional opposition to this coming from the military and coming from key think tanks and analysts in Washington, which I encourage you to read. My intention here is to show you that the idea that Russia and China are somehow natural adversaries of the United States is entirely a British concoction, despite the fact that many dumbed-down Americans have swallowed this particular British Kool-Aid. The fact is that the natural connection between the United States and Asia, both Russia, which is an Asian nation, and China, began long before the founding of the United States as a nation, even before it was discovered by Christopher Columbus. America began, in fact, as a thought object in the mind of some of the greatest minds of Western civilization, people like Nicholas of Cusa, people like Gottfried Leibniz, whom you see pictured here. It was as real then as it is today, because the nation is not just a physical location or just a government or something that we know with our senses. But the idea of the United States as a nation is a dynamic process, an idea, what was known as the city on the hill or the new world. And like Lyndon LaRouche today, Cusa and Leibniz not only dreamed about the future, they saw the future. Both the horror of a future under imperial domination and the great potential of a new world which they set about to create. A republic free of the oligarchical control of European monarchs and of global empire. And as we will see, Gottfried Leibniz had already established the natural alliance between the future United States that existed in his mind with Russia and with China before the official founding of this nation. So that natural alliance, which was reborn under Franklin Roosevelt, is finally coming back into being today under the inspiration of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, based on the concept of a new paradigm for the survival of civilizations. Great projects like the land bridge and the tunnel under the Bering Strait, uniting Russia and China and the United States by rail, bringing them together into a common mission for the future, can and must fulfill the creative discoveries of our forefathers and end the power of the empire once and for all. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus is well known now to have been attributed directly to Nicholas of Cusa, who, with his friend Paolo Toscanelli, had suggested to Columbus that he could reach the Far East by sailing west, and that he would likely find a new world in between. Columbus carried with him on that journey a map that had been presented to him by Toscanelli. As I reported in the first of these conferences in Frankfurt on the new paradigm, Leibniz was not only a follower of Nicholas of Cusa, but he was the seminal philosopher and scientist of his age, and also one of the great statesmen of all history. He worked directly with Peter the Great in Russia to establish the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1724. He worked very closely with the Jesuit missionaries in China, who had become the core of the scientific institutions there in China. And he even arranged the treaty between Russia and China, which was the first international treaty in history. He published a journal in Europe called Novissima Sinica, which means news from China, in 1697, which analyzed the writings of Confucius and Mencius and the great philosophic mind of the 12th century Sung dynasty, Jushi, which had been translated by the Jesuits, and which he, through this journal, made known across Europe. A quote from that journal, which will be relative to my report on the development in the U.S., is as follows. I read this in Frankfurt, too. I love this quote. So, this is Leibniz speaking. "I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, on the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life." Leibniz's analysis of Confucius, which I could speak about for days, is basically summarized in his saying that it is pure Christianity insofar as it renews the natural law which is inscribed in our hearts. The founding fathers of the United States were profoundly affected by the works of Leibniz and maintained contact with the Leibniz circles across Europe, and especially at the Russian Academy of Sciences. During the U.S. War of Independence, the British warships were seizing Russian ships and others that were doing trade with the colonies. This was continuing until Benjamin Franklin and some of his associates at the American Philosophic Society made direct appeals to their friends at the Russian Academy of Sciences and some of their Russian diplomatic contacts to deal with this, which led to the creation of something called the League for Armed Neutrality. And that league was declared that Russia and other officially neutral states had the right to trade with the colonies, and that any effort by the British to attack these commercial vessels would be considered an act of war and responded to. And believe me, this had an impact on the outcome of the Revolutionary War. After the war, the American naval hero John Paul Jones went to Russia and helped build the Russian Navy. And of course, America's greatest statesman, John Quincy Adams, was the first ambassador to Russia in 1809. Yeah. It's also important that leading Russian circles at that time published Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturing in Russian, translated, made sure it circulated widely in 1807, and told the Tsar that the principles that were in there were fully applicable to Russia as a continental country. And later, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was involved directly in the building of the first railroad in Russia between St. Petersburg and Moscow in the 1840s. So the British spent much of the 19th century trying to break up the United States and break up Russia, and China, for that matter, through warfare and through economic sabotage. The Crimean War against Russia in the 1850s was aimed at breaking up Russia, and this was soon followed by the British-instigated Civil War in the United States, which, of course, was very much intended to split this nation, and to maintain free trade, the British calling card, free trade in slaves and cheap cotton from the slave plantations for the Manchester mills. To some extent, the Civil War was an extension of the two British opium wars against China in the 1840s and 50s. Again, waging war to defend free trade in slaves and in opium. So again, the ties with Russia were absolutely crucial in our defeat of the British-run Confederacy. How many people today even know that the entire Russian fleet was deployed into the United States at the peak of the Civil War, into New York Harbor and into San Francisco Bay, right here? 1863. And this was the crucial point of the war, and the message was very clear. They had informed the British and the French that were they to proceed with their stated plan, which was to intervene in the Confederacy, it was a peace mission, you understand. The British were concerned about, it was a humanitarian intervention. The British had a very deep moral concern about the responsibility to protect the innocent Southern civilians who were being tortured by the marauding Northern armies. Sound familiar? So the Russians told the British and the French if they did this, they would be at war with Russia, that they would act, and that they would defend the legitimate government of the United States. And if that sounds familiar to what's happening today in Syria, it's no coincidence. So President Abraham Lincoln also understood that the United States was extremely vulnerable as long as the continent remained divided. And that's because California had just recently become a state in 1850, I believe, right after the 1848 gold rush, when thousands and thousands of Americans poured into California, and thousands of Chinese, by the way, at that time. But transport to the West Coast was very treacherous. It took months. And the country was by and large divided, which was one of the reasons that the Russians sent half of their fleet, or part of their fleet, into San Francisco so that the British couldn't pick off easy pickings here on the Pacific. So Lincoln and the Congress launched the Transcontinental Railroad. You can put the next slide up. Which that began in 1862, at the peak of the war, in the midst of this huge bloody Civil War. They launched the Transcontinental Railroad. Nobody said, well, gee, where are you going to get the money? We're waging wars, you know. So he did this to connect the nation by rail. And the result, of course, was the development of all those states in between, which ultimately became states. They were developed as agricultural and industrial lands. New cities were created. But there was another purpose to this, and that was as an outreach to Asia. The U.S. had been largely excluded from Asia before this time. In fact, our major commerce in Asia was largely run by Boston merchants who were outright British agents, who were directly, openly involved in the British opium trade in China, including the family of William Weld, who is the Massachusetts U.S. attorney who prosecuted Lyndon LaRouche and myself and others in the 1980s. Efforts by some of the more courageous American missionaries and others to counter the British in China were largely crushed just by the total British domination of the entire region before this. What this created was the possibility of taking this arrow through the United States to Asia, of taking the industrial production that had been developed by Lincoln during the Civil War and afterwards, to take that into Asia, into China, opening up the industrial might of the United States, of the Union, to trade and investment in Asia. So it's well known also, the third slide, it's well known that 80% of the workforce on the Transcontinental Railroad was Chinese, and that they were greatly respected for the quality of their work. It's surprising to read now how much they were respected, in fact, even though they were miserably paid. But less well known at the time is that the Russian engineers were also in San Francisco at that time. Put on the fourth slide. And that they and American engineers, at that time, the telegraph had been constructed along with the Transcontinental Railroad out to San Francisco. The engineers began working up the coast, well, you don't see it here, but working up the Pacific coast with a telegraph wire into Russian America. Russian America is now called Alaska, but it was Russian, you know, and with the plans to cross the Bering Strait and then cross Russia all the way to St. Petersburg. This was well underway, in fact. It was only stopped because in 1867 they succeeded in laying the transatlantic cable, and it became less urgent, so it got stopped. But that process of opening up that territory led to the U.S. purchase of Alaska from Russia, I think in that same year, or right around that time. So this was a project, by the way, that was very strongly supported by Lincoln. And after the war, Lincoln's economist, Henry Carey, who's been referred to here today, carried the idea of this transcontinental development to Europe. He took it to Germany, as Helga mentioned, where Bismarck used the American system idea to build the German state. And he took it to Russia, where together with Count Witte, they constructed the Transcontinental Railroad, or excuse me, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. You can put that slide on. Which, if you think about it, this was a second railroad connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific, just as the American Transcontinental Railroad did, just on a different continent. But it was the same driving conception. And it was part of, if you go back to that previous slide, it was part of this idea of a universal land bridge, which is the core of the land bridge idea, the universal land bridge that Lynn and Helga and the organization are fighting to create today, including that tunnel under the Bering Strait. So on the US-China connection, I want to talk about an individual whom you've almost certainly never heard of, but that very fact says a lot about American education. His name was Reverend William Speer, S-P-E-E-R. He was a dentist and a Presbyterian missionary who went to Canton, Guangzhou, in 1846 to open the first Presbyterian mission in Guangzhou. He became fluent in Chinese. He worked there for 5 years, but for health reasons, his wife and child died, and he had to come back. And he spent almost his entire life here in San Francisco working in the Chinese community, the immigrants in San Francisco. He opened the very first Asian Christian church within the United States. Can I have the next slide? That's it. It's still there. It's called the Presbyterian Church in Chinatown. It's very active today. And he started a school and a dispensary, the next slide, which is now called the Chinese Hospital, which is in Chinatown here in San Francisco. These were both started by William Speer. He spoke widely. He published pamphlets both in English and Chinese. He authored a book in 1870, which is 5 years after the Civil War, called The Oldest and the Newest Empires, China and America, China and the United States. And don't be distracted by his use of the word empire. He meant it benignly as a nation with a mission. I want to read you several passages from his book, which I think will give you a sense not only of this individual, but this individual as a leader who represented this Leibnizian tradition in America, despite the fact that such traditions get crushed repeatedly by British input. What he had to say about China was, quote, "It's hard to account for the common estimate of China and its people in Great Britain and America, otherwise than by attributing it to the influence of the bad East India Company and the diabolical opium trade. He reports that nearly all the books on China are written by, quote, servants of the British government or British missionaries, all corrupted by two fatal influences, namely the monarchy and their self-enrichment from the opium trade. So you see, he's not confused about the meaning of empire. And reflecting directly his debt to Leibniz and Leibniz's global vision, consider these passages. On the nature of the Chinese people, he said, quote, "Both Confucius and Mencius saw with bitterness the utter inefficiency of truth, which looks no higher than earth to reform society or to stay the power of the human passions. He believed that there were, quote, few nations of the world among whom the freedom of the people is more large and more squarely founded upon their intelligence or more carefully guarded against despotism than it is in China." He noted, of course, that in the Middle Ages, China was by far and away the greatest and most civilized kingdom on earth, but that with the coming of the Renaissance in the West, China stayed behind, stayed stationary, as he put it. In another quotation, which sounds like Leibniz virtually, but he doesn't actually quote him, he says, and remember the quote I read from Leibniz at the beginning, he said, "For centuries past, the most philosophic minds have predicted the vast consequences which should ensue when the two opposite currents of empire, one eastward and one westward, since the beginning of time, should at last meet and flow together. Upon our Pacific coast, this consummating event of the history of the world has now commenced." And on the nature of the human being, he again reflects Leibniz that the truth is written in our hearts. He refers to, quote, "the eternal principles of right which the governor of the world has written in the chambers of the human heart and made deeper and more authoritative than any statutes of human appointment." Alexander Hamilton, he writes, this is Speer quoting Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton presents their nature with the clearness of the light of the sun. Quote from Hamilton, "The deity has constituted an eternal and immutable law, which is obligatory upon all mankind, prior to any human institution whatever. He endowed man with rational facilities, by the help of which to discern and pursue such things as were consistent with his duty and his interest, and invested him with inviolable rights to personal liberty and personal safety. The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with sunbeams on the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power." Elsewhere, he quotes, essentially, again without naming him, Abraham Lincoln, from the second inaugural address, and I hope all of you have had the opportunity to read Lincoln's second inaugural address inscribed on the wall at the Lincoln Memorial. It's extremely moving. He says, "The ruler," referring here to God, "in due time asserts and displays divine justice and power by the terrible punishment of oppressors and wrongdoers, and compensation for those who have suffered. The history of African slavery and the judgments it brought upon us is surely the lesson which this nation should never forget." And finally, on his global vision, quote, "Three empires fill the vision of the future: the U.S., Russia, and China. Great Britain alone compares with them in the extent of her colonial possessions, but hers are remote and widely scattered, and will, when ripe as to the divine purpose, fall away from her, as the U.S. has done, and become centers of independent influence. Each of the U.S., Russia, and China are animated throughout by the same general spirit, and possesses a certain unity in aims, laws, language, social habits, and religious sentiments." So this was the driving conception of the truly American movement that was taking place during this entire first time, constantly at battle with the British Empire. And unfortunately, this particular vision was snuffed out by the British. They appealed to ignorance, to racism, and so forth, and to drive for empire amongst Americans, and were able to impose exclusion laws and launching the horrible periods of racist attacks against Chinese and immigration generally, against the melting pot. Reverend Speer fought this insanity, and he also spent several years in Hawaii, where not much later, the great Chinese revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, you can do the next slide, was trained in Hawaii by American missionaries, steeped in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton and of Abraham Lincoln, and went on to build a republic in China based precisely on these American system principles. So the mission today is the same, but the consequences of failure are far greater today. LaRouche has emphasized repeatedly that we must restore not only the vision, but the way of thinking itself of these great minds, people like Cousin and Leibniz and LaRouche, who saw the future, acted to destroy empire, and created this city on the hill, which is ours to lose or to recreate anew. Thank you.